Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan and Metapis. It's Ukraine War Frontline update for the 8th of May 2024. This is an ill-advised Frontline update that has happened far too often for my liking due to a combination of wine and beer and whatnot. But at the end of the day, I cannot go a day without doing the Frontline update if I can avoid it. I can't avoid it. I shouldn't avoid it because otherwise it leaves a gap in my mind as to what is going on the front lines, and also may in your minds as well. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, or our map, thanks to JR who has done the front line mapping update today, really on the mapping. And it's our map because you guys, it's yours as well. It's an open source thing that you guys can use and look at in your own time too. So anyway, if you don't know what the lines mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Now, good news is, first thing to recognize is there are some blue pins on the map. So that's pretty encouraging for the Ukrainians. I am going to play you 5 minutes of George Barros later from the Institute for the Study of War talking on Times Radio, because I think it's really interesting with regards to what he thinks about the Ukrainian counteroffensive going forward, and when that might be and what the Ukrainians are looking at doing. And the reason I'm going to play it to you is because actually it basically confirms everything I've been saying with regard to what I think the situation is and what I think the Ukrainians need to do. So it's kind of like good that I'm not just talking out of my posterior, because sometimes I get this imposter syndrome effect where I just think, who am I to say the things I do? Do I know what I'm talking about? Anyway, let's go to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea, and we can see that there's some good news here for the Ukrainians. I'm not going to pop into the Institute for the Study of War, the American military think tank, to look at their daily report because it's a bit late now. In fact, their new one's probably out already. Anyway, you can see that Ukrainians have made some gains near Kuzmivka, which is interesting. This is not where we've been looking at recently, which is Kotelivka and Kislivka. There's been some activity near Krokmalna. We're coming to the south of there. Now, I'm going to have to probably remind you, some of you who might be newbies won't know this area, but this is Novoselivska and Kuzmivka. Now, this was an area that both sides have been fighting over for an awful long time, and there have been a bit of back and forth here revolving around this railway line that goes north-south. This is an area that goes, if I remember correctly, downhill into, as you can see, Kuzmivka down there. And at the top of the hill, you have Novoselivska, which the Ukrainians had control of. Russians took control back of that, and then the Ukrainians re-liberated the town, and then the Russians took it again. And that's where we have it at the moment. I don't have any details from any tweet or anything. It might be forthcoming. Sometimes the map gets changed, and the map gets changed, and then Surreal Maps will produce some tweets. Sometimes almost 18 hours later. It just depends, but or sometimes they miss it out altogether, depending on how important they see the changes being. And sometimes if they're Ukrainian changes, they're less forthcoming with the declarations. But we can see that Surreal Map sees that the Ukrainians have made some gains. Now, is that a counterattack? Is that just after this amount of time there's been some evidence that the Ukrainians just are in these positions or the Russians aren't, or whatnot? I'm not too sure. So it could just be that there's evidence that's come out to suggest that the Russians do not control that area. Doesn't mean the Ukrainians have counterattacked in the last 24 hours. So just be aware of that. But anyway, some changes in the right direction to the mapping, at least in the Novoselivska area. And then as we come down further to the south, we come to the Terny Torska region. No changes there. Then to south of Crimea here, the Serebryansky forest, we have the Bilohorivka area where the Russians are not, or have been pushed back, arguably, in that very northeastern area of this whole sector. I think this is quite important that the Russians have been having a little bit of a hard time. the Ukrainians have been seen to be here, although Surrey Maps doesn't agree with the mapping here. It is apparent, as far as I'm aware, that the Russians have been pushed back from the chalk mine here, and they do not control this area at all. And indeed, they don't appear to control this area, as there's evidence that Ukrainians are in trenches around here. You can see, I don't know actually, no, probably not. I was thinking these are trench lines that you could see, but the mapping might not represent the latest imagery of the area. But anyway, up towards the forest and the Seversky Donetsk River, we have some possible pushing back of the Russian forces north of the high ground here. So if you remember, we have some interesting topography around here with the river on the, obviously on the lower ground there. We have high ground here with the hills. I don't know if they're even mountains. I remember seeing footage of Ukrainians firing from here. Let's show you where I am again. Back maybe a year ago, and actually this looked an awful lot higher. Some of these higher mountainous area or hilly areas looked an awful lot higher than just hills. Sometimes even on the 100% normal rendering of 3D here on the Google Maps or Google Earth, it doesn't quite do justice to how high and steep some of these places are. But nonetheless, this is where the Ukrainians have an advantage by having the height advantage over the Russians there, and it's very difficult for the Russians, I think, to gain an awful lot of ground in that area. And then you have the forest to the north and the Seversky Donetsk River here that the Russians are going to find very difficult to get across with equipment. You've got forest, river, and then sort of mountains on the other side. This is not going to be easy territory for the Russians to take. So I've told you that umpteen times before, but it's often worth reminding you, especially since 50% of viewers are newbies here. So anyway, the Ukrainians making possibly some advantage, some gains in that northern Bilohorivka area. We'll come out of there now and come down to Chaziv Yar. You can see there are no changes to the mapping today, which is really good news. It's been fairly stable now for some time, and this is the area that many are saying is the single main point of attack for the Russians. This unlocks Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk behind. If the Russians can succeed at Chaziv Yar, then the Ukrainians are on the back foot, and it could be a really important key. And if they can join that up to Ocheritina here, where they can intercept the road on the way to Konstantinivka, then the Russians can do some kind of larger pincer move. The question is, how much do they have left in the tank, the Russians? How many vehicles do they have in reserve? How many troops are they willing to throw at the front lines continuously? There are these claims that the Russians are storing up troops and equipment for a summer offensive, but the question is, if this is the weakest point of the Ukrainian forces in time, considering the American and European aid packages are going to be forthcoming or are getting to the front lines literally as we speak, then they want to be striking while the iron is hot. And so building up reserves, training them up, amassing them over time is potentially not the best use of those troops. Anyway, when we look at Chaziv Yar and we think, well, the Russians could be stalling to some degree. Now, it's not to say that Chaziv Yar won't fall, but the Russians are slowing down in their gaining of territory around here. And then we look at things like this. So as Javier Alvarez said to me today, like I reported that this morning a Russian soldier said that, hang on, I'm fighting at Chaziv Yar. And yes, it's an anecdote, but he said, I'm fighting at Chaziv Yar. I've got some paperwork to say some of my heavy equipment has been requested for the May the 9th victory celebrations in Red Square. And this is Chaziv Yar. This is like the main battle area. What are you doing taking away my heavy equipment to put on parade? This is absolutely crazy. And I then said this morning, well, if that is true, then what does this say about the desperation for the Russians in terms of needing equipment to show off, but also not having spare equipment that you would normally draw from, I don't know, St. Petersburg, somewhere within Russia. They're having to take equipment from the front lines to show to their Russian audience at home how wonderful the Russian armed forces are. So that was, it's an anecdote, right? But nonetheless, can we take anything from it? And he says, now Javier Alvarez says, now a group of Russian soldiers have been captured. Window of opportunity for the Ukrainians to counterattack around Chasiv Yar, he asks. I don't think one could go that far, but it is interesting that here we see 7 Russian soldiers captured. So 7 Russian soldiers captured by the Ukrainian forces. According to them, their commander sent them to attack well-fortified positions without any equipment and weapons. Many of their comrades died or were wounded. One of the POWs expressed a desire to join the Russian volunteer corps to fight against Putin's regime, and that's probably the guy that they have blurred out here. Do not come here, only death and pain are awaiting you. Just interesting. Yes, it's an anecdote. Yeah, it's 7 soldiers that have been captured, but if what they're saying are true, that many of their comrades died by point of fact that they were ordered, or the claim is they were ordered to attack a well-fortified position without the requisite equipment, then again, does that show that the Russians are in a good position going forward with regard to a summer counteroffensive, to indeed their offensive right now? Then, I mean, these appear to be the 7 soldiers being wrapped up here near Chasiv Yar, unless there are others, in which case double bad. But yep, it's not a great amount of soldiers, but that the Ukrainians are capturing soldiers when they should really be on the massive defensive here, I think does tell you something. When we haven't seen the map move really for the last week, possibly a tiny bit here, but really for the last week, and we've seen a claimed Ukrainian counterattack south of Ivanivska, between Klishivka and Ivanivska, you're wondering actually whether the Russians have they culminated. That would come and bite me on the arse, but I just don't think they have the resources to commit all across the front line simultaneously. That said, the Ukrainians are particularly weak, but I understand that the Ukrainians have thrown in some reserves to Chasiv Yar, and so that could be a reason why the Russians are finding it harder to move forward and are indeed being counterattacked and are indeed having POWs captured, which is not what you'd expect when the Russians are on the attack and the Ukrainians are sitting in defense. Okay, coming further to the south, we come on to the Avdiivka salient, which is the most troubling area of the front line for the Ukrainians, even though, as I've said already, the Chasiv Yar is supposedly the main point of attack for the Russians. So we have some more gains for the Russians around Ocheratina, really along the railway line further to the west here. Now, what's interesting about today's gains is that we are literally talking about, let's calculate that, 500 meters in one direction, and really we are talking about 100 meters in the other direction. So 500 by 100 meters, and that is the totality of the change around the Ocheratina area. So what does that tell you? Will we see large-scale gains around here going forward? I don't know. This could just be a bit of a breather for the Russians before they push again. There are some gains around the Pervomaisky area. We'll look at some of the sources, but again, not huge gains to be had around there either, and we've only got that coming from one of the mappers. Anyway, no report said yesterday that geolocated footage shows a small advance north of Ocheratina along the forest strip and the railway tracks, and that's pretty much what you're seeing there. Forest strip here and the railway tracks. So that seems to be what's going on there. So no reports continues. Russia also consolidated the area between Badichi and Semenivka, Novobakhmativka. This was considered a grey zone, but Ukrainian forces have left the area. I don't know that that is any different to my mapping here. Let's have a look. Let's enlarge that a little bit. So we've got Solovyove. and that would be around here. There we go. So just, yeah, that's this area there, which we already have mapped. So that's nothing on top of what we already have. Then when we come to spatial grounds here, another source saying Russian forces advance northwest of Ocheritina towards Novo-Alexandrivka. The push also signals the Ukrainian troops indeed retreated from Ocheritina a few days ago. So that's just another source confirming that the Russians are pushing in that northerly direction towards that road over here. We've got Novo-Alexandrivka being next on the agenda for the Russians as they push northwest there. Okay, then Surat Maps says that around the Pervomaisky area, initially the Russian army secured a series of trenches south of Pervomaisky, and then it added to that so that was the first one, and then we got some more around there, and then some advances in Netailove. The Russian army secured new positions south of Pervomaisky. In addition, troops took control over a series of high buildings in the center of Netailove. Okay, so that would be around here. That's to say, according to Surat Maps, and that might be, I wonder if that's subsequent to JR doing the mapping. Let's have a look. If we have a look there, there would be a step in that area. Yeah, I think that suggests that this is more recent, and we have seen, yeah, that's just one block there. So this is subsequent to JR's mapping. So we can expect from Surat Maps the mapping to change next time we have an update, to having a little bit of extra territory in the middle of Netailove, and then also this area here under their control, the Russians. That's according to Surat Maps, and not the other mappers, but no doubt the other mappers will follow suit eventually around here. I don't see that that the Ukrainians are going to stop the Russians taking this pocket here. It seems rather difficult for the Russians to keep hold of that. I don't see the Ukrainians to keep hold of that. I don't see the Ukrainians stopping the Russians at the moment pushing through Netailove. So even if Surat Maps might not be initially correct, they often are eventually correct by point of fact that it seems that the Russians are going to advance kind of nonetheless in some of these areas. Now we're going to come down to Krasnohorivka, further to the south from here, moving on past Novelska, that small agricultural outpost for the Ukrainians there, and we can see that the Russians have made gains according to both Surat Maps and Deep State Maps in the Staromikhailivka area to the west of there, between there and Krasnohorivka. So bit of a worry for the Ukrainians there. If we go to Surat Maps, as they talk about that situation west of Donetsk city, the Russian army has advanced southwest of the hunting house and entered into Krasnohorivka from the north, taking over a series of positions in the urban area until the nursing home and the stadium. At the same time, clashes with the Ukrainian army are taking place near the town hall. So this is to say that up here, the Russians are making advances through the northern suburbs of Krasnohorivka. It talks about the stadium. Not sure where I have that on here. Nonetheless, there's probably some kind of football ground or something around there. Not quite sure exactly where that might be. But yeah, claims that the Russians are pushing into the north, which is a bit of an issue for the Ukrainians, if there are any left in that pocket there. If this is indeed true, it's going to be pretty challenging. Krasnohorivka, looks like it is eventually going to be a bit of a done deal for the Russians. It's how long the Ukrainians are willing to hold out there, whether it's worth them holding out, attritionally speaking. So that's what's going on in Krasnohorivka. The Kiev Independent sort of confirms this, saying Russian assault groups break into Krasnohorivka, but they are blocked at a local plant. Small Russian units broke into the town, but their advance was blocked. Ukrainian soldiers stopped the Russian assault groups on the territory of the Krasnohorivka refractory plant. Nazar Voloshin, the spokesperson of the Kortitsia group of forces, told Army TV, quote, "The Russian soldiers are there now. The enemy is cut off from the supply of ammunition. Our defenders have full fire control over both Krasnohorivka and the outskirts of the town." So that's what the Ukrainians are claiming, back to the idea that the Russians have indeed, got some purchase in several areas of the town there. And then we come on down past Novomykhailivka. No information about Mariinka and Novomykhailivka for the last few days. As we've said before, it seems to work in pulses where you have one area, for example, Krasnohorivka at the moment, very active, then that quietens down as they get a breather. Mariinka then may start, and then Novomykhailivka starts. It's not often that they're all going off at once. But I don't know whether I'm just trying to be too positive, but it does seem to me that some of these attacks are slowing down, and that was the claim from the Ukrainians the other day, that the Russian attacks are slowing down. And the only reason they slowed down is if they didn't have the ability to keep that momentum up on a continued basis. And then we come down to the Velika Novosilka sector, where we have seen the Russians take some ground around Uruzhaini, and then the Ukrainians push back in Uruzhaini. And then today to the west of the settlement and the west of Staromyrsky, the Russians, as according to both deep state maps and Surat maps, the Russians have made some fairly significant gains. Really big difference here between Andrew Perpetua and Surat maps and deep state maps. So that's a good 3 kilometers plus. We may see that change tomorrow. We may see Andrew Perpetua find some evidence that these guys, the same evidence that these guys have looked at, and adjust accordingly, or there just could be a difference of opinion. Astrai Intel says there are reports of a successful Ukrainian counterattack. Oh no. Oh, that's supposed to be the Chasiv Yar one. I've got that in the wrong place. And then next one is pertaining to this area. This is Surat map saying during the last 2 days, the Russian army made significant advances west of Staromyrsky by taking control over the high positions that overlook the locality. In addition, the Ukrainian army withdrew towards the center of Uruzhaini. So that is what we have seen on the map there. We come out of there. I mean, I can't talk to confirmation that from, say, Andrew Perpetua, but we might see some change in his mapping, as I say, tomorrow. We come to Robotina, where there are various claims about Robotina today, actually, and some people saying that actually the Russians are, the Ukrainians are putting up a fight defending Robotina, and the Russians don't have the control of as much as they claim. We shall see. No, there's no tweet or anything from Surat Maps concerning this, just a small change in the eastern outskirts of Robotina. But yeah, as you can see, again, big difference between the mappers here. Surat Maps has the Russians controlling almost all of Robotina. The other two mappers have them controlling none of Robotina, and obviously they can't both be correct, so we'll see what happens there. But anyway, the Ukrainians are under some pressure there. I did have another source about that, and it annoys me that I haven't got that laid up for you. And then we come to the last part of the map. There are no changes, but we're going to talk about this island here that the Ukrainian General Staff claimed that they had taken control of. Then there were claims yesterday that the Russians were losing quite a lot of troops trying to retake it. And then, interestingly, we hear from various sources, this is Tim White talking about it, but there have been various sources talking today about Ukraine claiming that Russia is using jet skis to try to recover lost command there. Southern Command reports that the invaders tried to storm Nestraya Island in Kherson, which the invaders were forced out from earlier this month. There are no photos nor verification of the claim, but there were claims yesterday from the Ukrainians that the Russians have lost some fairly significant casualties in trying to retake this island. So that could be good, attritionally speaking, for the Ukrainians there. But yeah, no claims about Krinky or anywhere else along Dnipro River Delta. Almost forgot to go through what George Barros says for the ISW. Here is his little segment on Times Radio regarding a Ukrainian counteroffensive.
The Northeast.
Do you think there is any prospect, George, of a Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2024?
It's entirely dependent on two key variables, and those are Western weapon provisions to Ukraine. Do they come in sufficient volumes, and do they come on a sufficient timeline to enable the Ukrainians to do so? And the second key variable is Ukraine's own force generation. Will the Ukrainians be able to restore their combat effectiveness for their existing brigades? And will the Ukrainians be successful in the formation of approximately 10 new brigades that they're in the process of forming now? If both of those conditions are correct and true, aid comes in time and high enough volume, and two, the Ukrainians get to reconstitute their force, then yes, there are opportunities for the Ukrainians to conduct, I think, limited counteroffensive operations in late 2024. But I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the Ukrainians conducting a counteroffensive. The counteroffensive doesn't exist for the sake of the counteroffensive. The counteroffensive is much more important in terms of long-term, higher-level operational planning and campaign design. Because if the Ukrainians do not do any sort of active operations, they do not perform something active, and I'm not talking about a massive, large, decisive counteroffensive like how was planned in 2023. What it does is it de facto cedes the military initiative to the Russian military. And that means that the Russians get to present the Ukrainians a series of bad options. Do you defend Donetsk, or do you defend against a new offensive in Kharkiv? And if, God forbid, the Russians decide to open up a new offensive elsewhere in Ukraine, then it forces the Ukrainians to contort themselves in all kinds of directions and spread themselves thin in order to just react to the Russians. And the Russians, if they're skillful in how they employ their own campaign design, they will deliberately create these dilemmas so that 6 months from now, so that 18 months from now, so that 24 months from now, the Ukrainians will be in a much weaker spot. The only way for the Ukrainians to break out of this is by messing up the Russian plan and, in fact, imposing some dilemmas on the Russians that force the Russians to make a decision about where to prioritize Russian resources, about how to defend the territory that the Russians hold, even if it's in a small, limited sort of way.
So I've been talking over the last however long about how the Ukrainians should sit back and soak up the Russian attacks for 6 months to a year, just because the Ukrainians have done such a good job of attriting the Russian forces when the Russians attack. Or you could argue the Russians have done a really good job of attriting their own forces in attacking, that actually, if the Ukrainians can sustain those ratios as far as their own troop losses are concerned, then this is good for the Ukrainians. You look at the October attack from last year of Avdiivka, you look at 314 vehicles lost around Novomykhailivka, you look around at the 1,100 plus vehicles lost around Avdiivka, you look at the 1,000 troops lost for something like 9 out of the last 11 days along the front lines. The Russians are suffering with each kilometer that they take. But if you just sit back and soak up that pressure, even if it's giving you a really good ratio of losses, you are still allowing the other side to dictate what is happening and where it's happening. And that's not presenting your enemy with problems or dilemmas. Ideally, dilemmas. Problems have solutions. Dilemmas don't have solutions. They just have to, what do we pick that's the least worst outcome here? Ukraine want to present Russia with some problems, and they want to have at least some areas of initiative for the Ukrainians. Otherwise, the Russians have the initiative, they dictate the battlefield, and even though they are making those losses, they are still getting to attack where they want and not giving Ukraine the ability to take back land. So if the Ukrainians do sit back for 6 months, a year, and soak up that pressure, there will have to be certain positions along the front line where the Ukrainians go on the attack. So it's some kind of active defense where they are considering taking back some territory to keep the Russians, on their toes.
And the proponents of saying, "Oh, 2025 is the magical year in which the Ukrainians must conduct a counteroffensive," then for whatever reason, that implicitly says we're okay with ceding the initiative to Ukraine for all of ceding the initiative to the Russians for all of 2024. And generally in warfare, whoever holds the initiative for the longer period of time or the most, they have the advantage. And so what we've been trying to do at the Institute is educate people about, the importance of campaign design, of the operational art, and also the importance of the military initiative. And the Ukrainians should try to contest that, even if it's in a limited way.
For sake of argument, say it is late.
So I won't play any more of that, but you get the point. That's really interesting. So on the one hand, that's exactly what I've been saying, that the Ukrainians should sit back and trick the Russians. But on the other hand, they need to have some kind of active defense. They need to design some kind of operational scenario whereby they are putting they're giving the Russians issues, that they are seizing the initiative in certain areas, maybe in certain localized positions. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you, I would say tomorrow, but it is already tomorrow, so I'll speak to you later today.